everyone, and thank you for joining us today at our Monterey's Magical History Tour with Tim Thomas. Today we got a special guest. We're going to be talking about Jo Mora and the life and art. And so just a couple rules before we get started. I ask that everyone please mute yourselves while the presentation's going on to help limit distractions. And then also, if questions do arise, please feel free to put them into the chat. We will have some time at the end of the presentation for question and answering with Tim Thomas and Peter Hiller. But if questions do come and you want to just get them down, please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll read them out loud. And after that, Tim, let's start. It's all yours.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And I'm actually really excited about today's program. I talk about Jo Mora with my friend Peter Hiller. I've known Peter for a number of years. Actually, when I worked with the Modern History and Art Association Maritime Museum, I don't know how many years ago it was. Peter, do you remember when we did that exhibit?
Well, I do remember the exhibit, but old age and gray hair.
Yeah.
It must have been, I don't know, 15 years ago, probably.
At least that much, yeah.
Yeah.
It was a big exhibit about Jo Mora. Jo Mora is really sort of this iconic artist around the Monterey Peninsula. I'm sure all of you out here today are familiar with the name, or at least you have seen his artwork somewhere in Monterey. And so let me introduce Peter Hiller. Peter is a former teacher at All Saints Episcopal Day School and is the curator of the Jo Mora Trust. And Peter, welcome to today's show.
Thank you. Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
There's Jo Mora. So how old, when this picture was taken, how old was he, do you think?
Well, my guess is that this came as part of the family archive and there wasn't a date, but just based on his appearance, I would say this would have been in the 40s.
Yeah.
So close, he died in 1947. So, you know, somewhere near the end of his life.
Yeah. So let's go back to the beginning. I mean, Jo Mora was where was he born?
He was born in Uruguay. His father had moved there and fallen in love and married, and then his wife, they had two children. Jo was the second. He had an older brother, Luis, and the three men in the family all became very involved in the arts. Domingo actually went to Uruguay following work. He was a classical sculptor and was born, he was Catalan, and so grew up in Spain, studied in Spain, and went to Uruguay looking for work. Plus, he also had an interest in the gauchos of South America, and that would have ramifications later into Jo's life, and sort of sparked an interest in Jo as well. But the family only lived there for a couple of years. There was political unrest, and I don't think the work was as bountiful as Domingo had hoped. So they briefly went back to Spain and then ended up back on the east coast of the United States, which is where Jo spent the first 25 years of his life in this country. And the family moved around a little. They were in New Jersey, they were in Massachusetts and New York, and it had to do with work on the part of Domingo and where he was finding work, and that sort of dictated where they lived. But that's where Jo went to school, through grade school, and then he did go to art school as well. And eventually in Boston, that was where his first professional life flourished, as an illustrator for the Boston Herald, and then also as a book illustrator.
Yeah, so I remember he was a cartoonist, right?
He was. He did some cartooning work for the Boston Herald. The interesting thing to me is that those were the days before photographs had found their way into newspapers. The technology didn't exist at that point. So an editor would send out Joe as one of the paper's illustrators to the scene of the crime, and Joe would do sketches and drawings based on what he was seeing, and then those became the visuals in the newspaper. So there was a lot of very spontaneous kind of on the spot work, and Joe just took to it, like a fly to honey, and it was just something that came very naturally to him. He had started drawing as a young boy, and I think the fact that his father was an artist inspired him, and he continued that throughout his entire career and life.
And do you have any examples of his cartooning today?
Well, fortunately, we do. One of my favorite components of the family history is that Joe's mother, and then eventually Joe's wife, kept virtually everything that Joe did. And right in, back to when he was a young boy, and he used to write stories about what I'll call cowboys and Indians, and he would illustrate the stories. And we have those little 5-cent, 10-cent notebooks that are full of Joe's stories. It's just remarkable. I mean, it makes for such fascinating reading, and it just gives you such a sense of who he was as a young boy, and then as he got older. We have the evidence of his cartoon work that he did for the Boston Herald. He in 1907, roughly for that year, did a series of cartoons that would appear weekly on a Sunday. The series was called Animal Dumb, and Joe would have the entire page of the Sunday newspaper, and he would illustrate the story, and he also wrote the text for the story. And so there was one a week for virtually a full year. And we were fortunate to have copies of most all of those.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
So at some point he decides to come west. How old was he? When did he do that?
He came west in, I would mark the date as about 1904. And he grew up again with a strong interest in the American West. He, as I mentioned, he wrote stories about cowboys and Indians. I think he was inspired by his dad's interest in the gauchos of South America. And he had this sense, he'd actually seen the Wild West show, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And those things all contributed to Joe's interest in the American West, and also his sense that the cultures of the indigenous people were potentially changing. And that was based on migration from the east to the west, population shifts across the United States. And Joe just kind of worried that those cultures were going to lose their identity. And he wanted to see it before that happened. So his goal in coming west was to see the Hopi snake dance. He knew enough and had learned enough to know that that was a ceremony he was intrigued with and interested in. And so he, after saving up money from his illustrating work, he headed west, got on the train in Boston, and ended up in California, skipping over Arizona for the time being, only to kind of establish himself on the West Coast, and then start to plan when he would go back to Arizona. And while he was in California, he spent a lot of time in the San Ynez Valley, which is outside of Santa Barbara. He lived on the Donahue Ranch, which is just at the base of the mission in San Ynez. And that's where he started to really polish his own horseman skills and his comfort around horses, learning about the history and everything. He was enamored with the vaqueros. And here's a person who at this time speaks 7 languages, or at that time, 5 languages. His mother was French, his father was Catalan, so he had Catalan, Spanish, French, English, and found those to be wonderfully useful while he was in California, and had this wonderful experience there. And then eventually did go to Arizona and got fully immersed in with both the Hopi and the Navajo in Arizona, and to the point where the Hopi included him in ceremonies, and the Navajo would embraced him, and Joe actually would take Navajo uh, persons on hunting trips where Joe was the lead guide. Um, and he learned both their languages while he was there. And he wrote a very touching letter after having been there for almost 3 years. And he
Wow.
wrote to his parents and said, "If I don't leave today, I'm going to spend the rest of my life here."
Wow.
And so that gives you a sense of how ingrained he became in the community.
Yeah. And then he did a lot of artwork of the Kachina dolls and that kind of thing, didn't he? Yeah.
He did. Yeah, he did some fantastic work while he was there. I mean, it seemed like he was never without a pen or a pencil or his watercolors at his side. And he really, I think he did have a sense of wanting to document what he was seeing, but he did it in a very artful manner. There was nothing cold or dry about it. It had wonderful, wonderful elegance. The Kachina watercolors that he did, incredibly detailed. So they serve both as a document and a moment in time, but then they also were just artistically spectacular and
Yeah.
very well accomplished. So,
And
and that,
are you,
that was a series of paintings there, of which there were about 40 of them, and they're currently at the Smithsonian in Washington.
oh, okay. And if I remember my Jo Mora history correctly, didn't he actually ride a horse up the whole length of California?
Very close to it, yes,
Yeah.
he did. And that was during that period of about a year while he was in the San Ynez area. He initially realized he had missed the Hopi snake dance. The snake dance does not follow our calendar, and so he realized he was going to have to wait pretty much a year to go to Arizona. And so during that time, he decides, well, he'll explore the El Camino Real. So he takes his horse, which he's purchased while he's in the San Ynez Valley, rides over the San Marcos Pass down to Santa Barbara. He gets on a boat with his horse, who he named Lady. The boat sails down to San Diego. They get off, and Joe proceeds then to ride north with a copy of Crespi's diary, and so from the Portola expedition. So he's tracing their route and feeling very much like he's even seen campsites that they had used. And he goes from mission to mission from San Diego up to San Juan Bautista, stopping at each of the missions, sometimes doing a pencil drawing, sometimes pen and ink, other times watercolors. And he's also keeping a journal, a meticulous daily journal. He's got one of the first Kodak cameras, so he's taking pictures. And he uses some of those pictures as reference material when he does his artwork. And he probably, he's got his bedroll and maybe a change of clothes, and that's it. And he did that, and it's an amazing story. I mean, it was,
Yeah.
Quite an adventure.
I don't think you could do that today.
No, well, yeah, most
So-
of
So when did he?
are quite changed.
So when did he first come to Monterey, and what brought him? Why did he come to Monterey?
Well, he actually saw Monterey on that trip. So that would have been 1904.
Yeah.
And I would mark that as the first time that he came here. However, it was very brief, that visit, because he then, shortly after that trip, he then did his time in Hopi, and he left. He went across the Central Valley through Yosemite, the Mojave Desert, and on to Arizona.
All by horseback?
Studebaker wagon, pulled by a couple of mules named
There you
Tom
go.
and Jerry. And he was with a friend of his who had come from the East Coast to accompany him. But that was a great, story too, the trip across, the West to get to Arizona. And then he would come back in 1920. And that was the result of, and that kind of leads into the visual we're looking at now. But he had, after he came back, well, that moment when he told his parents it was either stay or leave, that moment also resulted in him getting married very quickly after he came back to California. He had occasionally gone to visit a family friend. She was in San Jose. They got married, soon, really very quick, soon after Joe got back. And that was 1907. And then they would move up to the Bay Area. They lived in the Mountain View area. Joe bought a ranch. He had to set up a studio, one in San Francisco, one also around Mountain View. And that was where he lived for about the next 10 plus years. And there was he was commissioned to do a sculpture during that time that is still on view next to the De Young Museum in Golden Gate Park. It's a statue of Cervantes and Don Quixote.
Right.
And that piece led to a commission to do the cenotaph, which is at the Carmel Mission. And so in 1920, and then by this time, the family has grown from 2 to 4. Joe's son, Joe Jr. has been born, and daughter Patty. And so in 1920, the family moved down here to the peninsula so Joe could work on that commission. And they stayed, all 4 of them for the rest of their lives here.
And then at some point he was hired by the Hotel Del Monte, right?
Yes, well, wonderful connection. The connection begins with Joe's membership in the Bohemian Club, which is, was pivotal for Joe's career and financial security to some extent, as he got commissions based on people that were also members. He also, made friends with some of the other artists who were a member of the club. And so that was a wonderful, wonderful connection for him. And it did lead to him doing a lot of work with SFP Morris, who also was a member of the club. And when they found themselves both here on the peninsula, it led to a lot of work, Morris commissioning Joe to do a number of different things.
And the map that we see here, that's inside the cover of the Don of the Dons book, what year was this?
1926.
Okay. So,
and I love to show this because, and I'm sure you know Steve, but Steve Harris is a local historian and spent a lot of time working at the Monterey Museum of Art, and that our paths crossed back in the 1990s when I was first getting interested in Joe. And Steve proposed to me, he said that this flyleaf in this book is ostensibly Joe's first map. And I absolutely agree with him. I mean, I think it's geography that Joe would then do 2 other times on behalf of Morris. But, I have never come across anything that predates this, except for a childhood map that he did while he was in grade school.
Sure.
But this certainly, I think, led to the other carts that Joe did. He referred to his maps as carts, and there are pictorial maps. And I definitely think this is the first one. So this is 1926. And then shortly thereafter, within a year or 2 of this, he did a large version of California, and he did 2 maps for Morris. Both of them are the Monterey Peninsula. And in fact, we'll see some of them. We can go forward.
Yeah, let's go.
But so these are illustrations from Don and the Dons and Tierney Ford's book.
Well, let's back up one more, Chica. I want to see this. I love this. So depicting the cross that Portola left when they were in Monterey in 1769.
Right.
And so based on a description that when they came back in the spring of 1770, finding the cross painted and the sardines on the attached to the arrows there. I like that. All right.
Yeah. So Joe found himself, again, this was a few years after he'd been here, but he meets Ford and they become friends. There's also, I think Morris, if I'm not mistaken, kind of commissioned this book, or at least encouraged Tierney Ford to write it. And then, it was a small town, and, so Joe ended up being the person who illustrated it. And Joe's illustrations are largely sites around the peninsula.
Right.
Some historic and some that were actually there at the time.
Polar bear fight or catching the bear.
Yeah.
So this is based on that was based on a photograph, and that's a thing of the French restaurateur. But actually, that's the Monterey jail, as where they are.
Yeah.
Across the road from his restaurant.
Well, there's bars in the window, it looks like.
Yeah. So if you're in Monterey, that's about where the Peach Coffee is today. And Trader Joe's be right over here.
And at this time, Joe's falling in love with the history of California. He's falling in love with the local history. This is a sketch that would have, I think, been in the back of his mind when, and the next slide shows a diorama that Joe did that, Michelle, we can go ahead one, and there we go. So this is the Lenovia piece that Joe did which is now at the Naval Postgraduate School. That building and complex used to be the Hotel Del Monte. And so this goes back to the days before it was the Naval Postgraduate School, but the diorama is still in place. And interestingly enough, it technically belongs to the Monterey History and Art Association.
Right.
It was designed very specifically to be set into the wall in the Lenovia room.
Right.
And so the idea of moving it is kind of overwhelming and probably not necessary. The only sad thing is that access to the grounds is not as easy as it used to be. And so in order to see this, you have to either be at the Naval Postgraduate School doing business or try to make arrangements to stuff. But it's a wonderful piece, and it is still in the same kind of top condition that it was when Joe made it.
And when I worked for History and Art, we talked about taking it out and moving it over to the museum. And yeah, you're right. The job to do that was almost impossible. And so we decided, let's not try it.
Yeah. Well, and the postgraduate school has been a great guardian of it. And it's in, like I said, it's in, wonderful condition, and it's in a room that's used on a regular basis. So it's not as if it's, hidden away in a closet somewhere. But it is enjoyed. And this is a sculpture Joe did of Morris. They were friends, and they shared a lot of joys of life, horseback riding. Morris played polo. I don't doubt that Joe joined him in that at times. Morris was an artist. He painted, and so they had that in common. And so this is one of the last pieces Joe did in terms of sculptures, and it was an ode to his friend, S.F.B. Morris.
Very good.
And we've got this as another illustration from Don and the Dons, but I included it because of the owl, which is the symbol for the Bohemian Club. And I don't doubt for a minute that that was in the back of Joe's mind when he was doing this illustration. And then, of course, the visual arts and the literary arts, Joe was able to participate in virtually all of the arts.
Yeah, it's a nice illustration.
And here we are with, this is the second cart that Joe did for Morris. This one emphasizes the 17-mile drive. And one of the things that's fascinating is the little vignettes of the historic adobes. In Joe's archive, we have the actual photographs he took of those buildings. So again, you can see where he used photographs just as a reference when he would then go to do his artwork.
And of course, he's famous for the animals in there. That
Yes.
I love those. Yeah.
Yeah, I think once he became a father, that animals seem to be a continuing theme in the family history. And
The
there's,
Hotel Del Monte in the upper corner there.
yeah.
Yeah.
So these are, when Jo does these pictorial maps, they're a wonderful combination of factual information and yet a lightheartedness that it edges on almost cartooning, but at the same time, the information is accurate, and it's a wonderful segue into history, really.
Yeah,
Makes it
absolutely.
very accessible and enjoyable to look at.
Ah,
And then this was a piece he did for the hotel as well. He did the illustrations of this cocktail recipe book.
yeah. One famous people. This is their cocktail.
Yes, yes. Guests of the hotel would submit their ideas, and some of them ended up in print, including Jo's. One of my favorites, though, is Theodore Dreiser's. It's based on his book, The American Tragedy. It's 2 glasses of gin, the juice of 1 grapefruit and half juice of half a lemon. It's not 2 shots of gin, it's 2 glasses of gin.
Yeah.
And then these are 2, and we'll see the other 10, but these are 2 illustrations that Jo did for Morris. And this was very clever merchandising at the time. Morris wanted to entice people on the East Coast to come to California and to stay at the Hotel Del Monte. And so he had Jo do this series of drawings that trace the history of Monterey in California. And each month, one of these pictures would appear in a magazine that was published nationally, for example, Esquire, as an ad. And below the picture would be a paragraph of text talking about the history of the visual. And then it would also end by just saying, come visit us at the Hotel Del Monte in Monterey, California. And so that they were used for advertising. They also found their way to menus at the Hotel Del Monte.
Right.
And those have become sought after collectibles.
I collected a set of the menus at one point.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
they're so much fun, and individually they are all so engaging. The image on the right there, the pirates, was actually, I think was the first item that I ever bought. And we were at a Western event at the Trail and Saddle Club in Carmel Valley, and there were vendors, and one of the vendors had this menu in their booth. And at the time, one of my sons loved the Pittsburgh Pirates. So for what, I don't know how that came about, being in California, but he did. And so we bought this for him for $10, and he still has it to this day.
Oh, good. Because it's worth a lot more than $10 today.
And so we can go through this, but it's just a really fun series. And again, you can trace the whole history of the community and different aspects of it, and a very clever advertising approach, I thought. We get up to modern times there with the polo players, and then it was those visuals were used in a number of different ways. And so here's a brochure that was published using a couple of them. I think the next picture, well, there we go again, and inside with some of the landmarks. This was like a directory that was published. That picture, they added color to it, but again, that's one of Jo's drawings. And then the Monterey History and Art Association used it as well for one of their Adobe tours. Excuse me. And then this is another piece that he did for Morris. This is the front of an invitation to New Year's Eve celebration.
Oh, beautiful.
You could open this up. And that's what happens when you open it up. So the two edges fold up out, and then this is the invitation for the New Year's Eve party, dinner, and dance.
Very nice.
Yeah. And here we are, your beloved Pop Ernst
There's Pop Ernst
version.
Right, so this is the menu. This was a giveaway. So Pop also was a master of marketing, and so Jo Mora, of course, did the inner part, and then the outer section is done by Peter. You know,
Ferdinand Bergdorf.
no, this is Armin Hansen.
Oh, Armin Hansen. Okay, thank you.
Did all that stuff
Yep,
on the
yep.
inside.
Yeah.
And they get it for free abalone dinners. But Sean, can you put up the first one that I sent you?
Yes.
So this is the first menu that Pop actually ever had in his restaurant. He initially opened a restaurant on Alvarado Street in 1907. He left Monterey in 1913, came back in 1918, opened the restaurant on the Monterey Wharf in 1919, but they didn't have any paper menus at that point. Everything was either on a chalkboard or was done verbally. And then in 1932, he had this menu produced. Again, you can see as a Jo Mora artwork, and it was originally printed on the sort of heavy cardstock, and it wasn't intended for people to keep. It was their menu, and but people would take it home because they loved the artwork. It was such a great souvenir, and so he decided to have that giveaway produced of the two artists did, Jo Mora and Armin Hansen, and it was really proved to be a great marketing tool for the restaurant, and because people kept those things and put them in their scrapbooks or sent them to their friends, you know, back in Ohio or Nebraska or New York. You know, we had dinner at this wonderful restaurant, and people remember that restaurant. And such, you get abalone dinner for 75 cents.
Yeah.
Actually, that was a lot of money in 1932, actually. So that's pretty good. All right, let's go back to the other slide.
You can't even pay for parking at the wharf for 75 cents now.
That's right.
That second menu, the one that you have, is wonderful. I don't think I've seen that before.
And by the way, this is, of course, Pop Ernst in the drawing, and he always wore that red fez, and nobody knows why, not even his family. But again, it was a marketing tool, and it's something I believe he got at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. He was living there, working for a restaurant, introducing abalone to the world at that time, and he wore that fez always because people remembered him, but more importantly, people remembered his restaurant.
Yeah, well, and they were the Moras were friends with Pop Ernst, and
oh, absolutely, yeah.
I think they went fishing together, and I don't doubt that this was a barter situation, because Jo would often do that. He would exchange his artwork for, in this case, dinner, and so that was one of the ways that Jo fed his family, was trading his artwork.
And I understand he had a special place he liked to sit at the restaurant when he was there.
Well, and it also, just to give you a sense of the breadth of Jo's abilities and involvement in the world of creativity, this is a house in Monterey on the Mesa that Jo was the signed designer for. The house still exists. It's happily lived in by a family. They own the blueprints, the original blueprints still. So it's, you don't necessarily think of Jo as an architect when you start to think of his career, but sure enough, he was probably responsible for several buildings one way or another, and to a certain degree. And he often worked with M.J. Murphy as well, who was a local builder and famous for the work that he did on the peninsula.
Yeah, and I believe he was somewhat involved with the design with the Carmel Library at one time too.
Well, yeah, that was a story that didn't end out to Joe's liking necessarily, but yes, he was. He did put in an effort to help design that building.
Yeah.
And then we see this is kind of a curiosity in a way, but this is the Pacific House down at across from the wharf at the end of Alvarado in Monterey. And what I would like to call your attention to are the three figures that are up on the balcony. And those are cutouts that the state of California used or made as a result of asking permission of Joe's son, Joe Jr., to use those images as they told the story of California history. And what my favorite part about this story is that Joe Sr. had passed away at this point. The images were still there, and the state of California approached Joe Jr. and said, would you be willing to let us use those as part of the displays in the Pacific House? And if you go in the Pacific House, I would say 40 to 50% of the visuals are all based on Joe's artwork. So Joe Jr. said yes, but he said, but there's a cost involved. I would be happy to do that, but I don't want to pay California income tax for the next several years, as that's my exchange, that's the monetary reward. And they went along with it. So Joe, that was the fee Joe paid, was getting out of paying income tax in California.
Really? I didn't know that part.
I tried that when they at some point when Joe Jr. had passed away, I took on the responsibilities of doing some of that licensing, and the state actually approached me again for a display up in Santa Cruz, and I tried the same ploy, and they said no way. I didn't have Joe Jr.'s touch.
I guess not.
And there's an example through one of the windows of Pacific House of one of the displays.
Yep.
But Joe's work just fits so perfectly in telling the story of the Monterey Peninsula in California. We have some other examples. And these, again, look familiar because some of them were similar images to what he had done for Morris. Then we can shift over a little bit to Monterey History and Art Association, and there's a wonderful connection there with the Mora family and the association. And this is an example of a project that came about, but Julie Burton Caraval, who I know Tim and I both know and have worked with, and she has moved to Santa Fe from the Monterey Peninsula, but she put together a number of pieces about Joe, and this is one that you can still find this. In fact, I think at Casa Serrano on Pacific, which is open 2 to 4 on Saturday and Sunday, and has a wonderful exhibit of Jo Mora's work. I think they have some copies of this, but it's a really nice, concise listing of a lot of the highlights of Joe's life. And
as I understand it, Peter, that Monterey Historic connection to Jo Mora goes back a long way, and that during the Depression they would buy art for him at full price, and that that really helped his family.
It absolutely did, and that's very true. In fact, Patty, Joe's daughter, was a member of the History and Art Association back in, gosh, it would have probably could have been as early as the 30s, but definitely 40s and 50s. And there were several times when the association bought material from the Mora family. If they had medical bills that were piling up and they needed some cash, they were able to sell some things. Other things were donated. And Joey was always so grateful about the way history and art conducted their negotiations that he actually left a couple of sculptures to the association in his will. And that's the only situation where he did that, where he gifted anything. And it was just out of gratitude for how nicely, I mean, Patty's involvement in the association, but also how gracefully they had treated the Mora family. So Joey was very grateful about that.
And I believe that History and Art has the largest collection of Jo Mora in public hands. Is that right?
Well, that's the way I refer to it, yes.
Yeah.
In that it's a membership organization, but
Right.
it's open to the public. Their
Right.
collection is on
Right.
view whenever Casa Serrano is open. And we were just there as a result of Christmas in the Adobes on both Friday and Saturday night of this last weekend. And it's just a joyful experience to be in the room where they have his artwork. And it's a wonderful collection of work. Most of it's original, which you don't see very often of Joe's work. Most of what you see are things that have been, printed in multiples, but there's a lot of original work there, and it's just a great display. And it was a wonderful event both evenings. Yeah.
When I first went to work for History and Art in the early 90s, they used to sell his carts at Casa Serrano, the Monterey Peninsula ones and the California one, for $5.
Yeah.
I didn't get any. What's wrong? I should have.
Yeah, I think the price has gone up and they're hard to find now. And here's an example of the first cart that Joe did for Morris. And this is not the cart was designed as a poster. Here it's used by the Pebble Beach Company as the cover of their forest activities booklet that they used to pass out. But you can see the same geography that we looked at with the 17-mile drive version, but just a different interpretation of it. And
here we are.
Based on the time of year, I had to throw in something about Christmas and Joe's celebrations of Christmas. And this is the red and beige piece are an example of Christmas cards that Joe used to do each year. He would do a new drawing and it would be the family Christmas card that they would send out to friends. And then the lower piece is almost mural-like. It's painted on particle board, and it's probably 5 feet long. So the scale is a little deceiving here, but this is something that he did and probably was in a shop window in Carmel, advertising his map of Carmel that was at the time for sale for 50 cents.
So is this piece with the trust now?
Yes. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Ah, very nice.
Yeah, and then this is a large mural, again on some kind of a heavy map board. I love the phone number down there.
Yeah, 370.
Yeah. And another example of our topic of the day, Jo Mora, and here he is. What I love about this is it gives you a real sense of his approach to making his maps. And so you can see to his left is the rolled up probably tracing paper, and that, by evidence of things in the archive, there is a pencil drawing on tracing paper of one of his carts. And so then you figure that's the first step, and then he would go to ink that image, and then eventually they would add color, and then the items would be sold. And it also gives you a sense of the scale. And the originals, the printed versions were big enough, but the originals were even bigger. And so this is how Joe had to devise a way to lay down and be able to draw comfortably. And I wanted to include his two most well-known pieces, even though they're not connected necessarily to Monterey, but we'd be remiss to miss these. And so these are the pieces that probably are most obvious if you mention the name Jo Mora. these are what are going to come to a lot of people's attention or mind. And simply because they were printed in the largest numbers over the years, so their distribution was wider, and they made their way into more people's homes. A colleague of mine where I used to work told me his story about the sweetheart of the rodeo on the left, and he said, yeah, he used to have it in his bedroom and he would throw darts at it. And so just typical what you do in a kid's bedroom. But it found its way to the cover of the Byrds album, so that's why a lot of people are familiar with it as well. What I always appreciated about this is that Columbia Records saw fit to give Jo credit on the back of the album. It says illustration by Jo Mora, and so that doesn't always happen. So that was nice.
And that was a groundbreaking album, actually, for the Byrds.
It is, yeah, it is. It was, it's a really important album for the Byrds and for the kind of history of music at that point. So, and that image has become very, very heartfelt, shall we say, to people. This is a tattoo on the calf of a gentleman in Germany who contacted me and asked permission if he could do a cartoon with the image, and I was not going to get in the way of that. So since then, I've our next slide shows two other people who have embraced the image with tattoos. And then on Saturday night last week, I met another person who had a tattoo of the same image and stuff. So so it's the single item, I guess, that resonates with most people as far as Joe's concerned.
And I remember as a kid, the Indian one, it used to be in the bedroom of the Cleaver boys and Leave It to Beaver.
Well, let's look at the next slide.
Oh, there it is.
We go. So this is a still from the Leave It to Beaver TV series, and you're absolutely right. There it is on the wall in Beaver's bedroom. So.
There you go.
And I've been able to establish a wonderful relationship with the Monterey County Fair and Kelly of Paolini, and so we've used Joe's artwork, I think 4 times and maybe 5 as a visual for the fair. Got a couple of examples.
Very nice.
And then this one, this was bittersweet. This was the most recent one, which was, this is the visual at the top is a mural that Joe did. It was part of 7 murals that are now on display at the Trotter Gallery in Pacific Grove. And the subject matter was absolutely perfect for Monterey's 250th birthday. And so, I pitched it to Kelly. I said, look, you got this, there's not going to be anything better. And she totally agreed. And they produced this as a poster. And then sure enough, this fair was canceled because of COVID, and it never happened that year in 2020. And so I don't know what even happened but you would have seen this on the transit buses as advertising and T-shirts and everything else. And it was just so sad because it was such a perfect connection between the anniversary and the fair. And a little unabashed advertising, but I have finally written the biography about Joe, and it's available for purchase out in the book world. I know River House Books has copies. The Trotter Gallery has copies. Olivia and Daisy out in Carmel Valley Village, I think they have copies. So it was kind of something I had to do based on the time I put into enjoying Joe's work and his life and his family, and it was a pleasure to put it together. And so far it's been well received as far as I can tell. And
very good.
There we go.
Congratulations on that, Peter.
Yeah, thanks. And then we've got a couple. we can leave this up while we talk and answer questions and things, but there's a couple of places where you can see Joe's work, and then also some exhibits that are currently up to view.
So we are going to have we talked about the idea of having a little contest today where the winner can win this wonderful postcard of the Populous restaurant with the Jo Mora artwork on it. They also gave these away at the restaurant as another part of the giveaway, but we weren't really sure how we were going to do the contest part. So we have to think about that for a minute. But you can find these postcards. I know you can find them on eBay, but we should give one away. So maybe some of the first one who can in the chat put in who the other artist was besides Jo Mora, because we talked about him. You can win that card. That sounds like a good way to go.
Yeah, good.
And then we also want to show that video you brought with us before we run out of time.
Okay. Well, we could do that now. Well, and then if people have questions, you know, I'm in no hurry, so I'm happy to stay and answer questions. But nope, there we go. I think we got a couple of quick.
Yeah, Joaquin, I think was the first one there.
But this is what you're going to see is a film clip from the Mora family archive. That this is old, gosh, I don't know if it's 8mm or, I mean, it's very old family movie that they took during the Sarah pageant that went from Monterey to Carmel.
Which was an annual event, Sarah thing. So I love the Native people, right? All dressed up. Oh my gosh.
So there's a whole historical change in costume as we go through this. I mean, it's almost as if Joe's map or the menus he did for Morris have come to life here.
And they would hold this every year, and they would have contests. Men you could grow mustaches and learn Spanish, and
I think that's Joe's daughter, Patty.
yeah.
And I'm not positive, but this seems to be at the intersection near Alta Bakery and that kind of multi-street intersection. And it could be the barns in the background are the ones that are still there on the property.
Right. I know Cooper House.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's where a lot of this was held. Also on the property, Hotel Del Monte would hold a lot of this.
So some of our viewers may have relatives that participated in this. And yeah, it goes all the way up to the field artillery, World War I. And then cleaning up after the horses.
Oh, that's what they're doing. Very good. So anybody have any questions, I think, today? We can unmute themselves, I think, right, Sean?
Yes. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat. I can read the ones in the chat, or feel free to just chime on in. And for Peter or Tim.
Well, and I'm reading the questions that were already there. And to Bob, I believe that that was the image you're referring to as far as the dinner menus probably was part of that series. I would guess that that's true. And then it looks like, oh gosh, it was close to a tie, but Joe Livernoy's Arm Enhancer answer is on top of Joaquin's. So.
All right then. And Joe, this is your card.
And then Marty, I speculated as to what corner street it is, but the Monterey Library has a copy of that video. I'm not quite sure how to dig it out, but you could probably stop frame it, you know, at some point and try to really figure out what the buildings are to get a more specific answer.
Yeah, you know what?
Oh,
I have two of them.
We have
Oh,
some
we'll
very
give-
honest players here.
yeah.
Both will win the card. How about that?
Okay. Yep. Joe stands corrected. Yep.
So Joaquin and Joe, I'm going to put my contact information into the chat. If you would like to send me an email with your contact info, I will make sure you get the cards from Tim.
Great, thank you.
And then I see John's question about the difference between the 1921 and, I mean, 2021 and the 2019 editions of my book. And that's, the long answer will take us too long, but the short answer is that the Book Club of California was the publisher who initially published the biography. And those of you that are familiar with that as an organization, they are an old membership organization that celebrates the art of letterpress printing and the fine art of bookbinding. And it's a wonderful group, and I've been involved with them for a number of years. They published another piece that I did about Jo Mora several years ago, and they agreed. They were actually the third publisher I'd approached, and that's a longer story. But they said yes. And so they did a beautiful, beautiful edition of the biography. It was a totally different format. It was a much larger book. Much of it was letterpress printed. It was hand bound, comes in a slipcase. It was a limited edition. It was signed and numbered. And a beautiful, beautiful presentation. Part of my agreement with them was that, well, I don't know if I mentioned, but it's also very expensive, being a limited edition. And part of my agreement with them was that, you know, assuming that it sold adequately, that I would then be able to reach out and look for a trade edition of the book. And so that happened pretty quickly. I reached out to one of the publishers that I'd actually talked to before the book club agreed, Gibb Smith, who were in Utah, and I had established a friendship with an editor there, Katie Killebrew, who actually approached me while I was just starting to write the book and asked if I was interested in doing so, which I was. And yet their marketing department at the time, and this is back 2018 or so, decided that they didn't think it had a big enough market. I think they were picturing a big coffee table type book with very expensive color prints, things like that. So they declined at that point, but Katie and I stayed friends. And when the time came for me to look for a trade edition, I went back to Katie and said, you know, and at the time then I was thinking a print on demand situation. They decided they didn't want to, that it had too many visuals to do that justice. So, but we kept talking, and they finally said, well, what about if we totally reformat it, change the size, change, you know, all of the appearance, everything else. And they said yes. So they took that on. This happened during the worst of COVID. Everybody was out of their offices into their homes, and somehow it was a miracle that it went through. The whole publishing process happened. I was able to make a few changes, nothing huge, but we did include some more, couple more art pieces. There were just, you know, I learned some things from looking at the first version of the book that I was able to adjust in the second. So there's some subtle changes, but it isn't huge. And except that the format's totally different. This book you can read in bed, although it's pretty heavy because it's printed on very heavy stock. But the price point is totally approachable. So that was a huge difference. And I have to say, I absolutely loved both publishing experiences, but the second one with the trade edition, it opened my heart because I knew it would be available to so many more people who, you know, wouldn't have normally spent, you know, hundreds of dollars on a collectible book, which I totally understand. I mean, it was, but yet it was a great way to get it out initially. And so consequently, the trade edition is out there, and I'm thrilled with the way it turned out. So.
All right, very good.
Marty, I see your hand is raised. Question?
Yeah, question or maybe comment. I was recently given a framed version of the Sweetheart of the Rodeo that I think is an original from the 1930s. So I guess Peter or Tim, if either of you guys wanted to come by and see that, or let me know. I'm happy to share that with you. And I mean, I feel like at some point in time, it's the kind of piece that should be with the trust or be in a museum somewhere, because it's in good shape.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you may already know the answer to this, but that image originally was a commission by the Salinas Rodeo, California.
Yeah.
In 1933. And so if you look at the top, I don't know, 10% or 20%, there's either a yellow background with black silhouettes, or there are two maps, and one map of Salinas and one kind of the peninsula. And that, the original version Joe did, he sold it to them, and it had those two maps in it. Well, pretty quickly, Joey realized we should never have given that away or sold it, because it's got legs. I can go sell it and everything. So what they did was in order to unencumber them from copyright problems and the fact that they had sold it to the rodeo, or they say rodeo, they changed it. And so from that point on, the Mora family continued to sell it. So if you, I mean, that's the first thing to look at, is if it's maps up there near the top, or if it's the yellow with the black silhouettes. And so from the time that Joe changed it to the silhouettes, from that time on, the Mora family sold it, and it's been reprinted a good half a dozen times at least, and usually 1,000 at a time. And once they get sold down to a certain point, they print it again and stuff. So that's a good marker just to check, to get a sense of when it was done.
Okay, I believe, I'll have to check, but I believe this one has the two maps.
Yeah, and that is a very collectible item. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll double check. I can't pick up my computer and
yeah,
the hallway, but it's a centerpiece in my house.
Yeah,
Very nice.
All right, I'm going to share the screen from the PowerPoint again.
And I want
on where to go see Jo Mora artwork. So I cannot see anyone else. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to speak up or put it in the chat.
And Peter, I want to thank you for this afternoon. It was a great program. I really appreciate your time and all the work you do on Jo Mora. And just wonderful stuff.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. And I always love hanging out with you, Tim. And thank you, Sean. And yeah, this was fun.
Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us. Jo Mora's artwork's just amazing. So it's always fun to learn about it.
And then next month's program, we're going to have my friend Don Kors, who's a librarian at Hopkins Marine Station, and he has a new book out called, actually comes out on Tuesday, called Tidal Odyssey, Ed Ricketts and the Making of the Between Pacific Tides. Well, thanks everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone else, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. Like Tim said, the next program will be next month. Please feel free to register for it on the library's website. And if you would like to revisit Tim and Peter's talk today or share it with other people, this recording will be put onto the Monterey Public Library's YouTube page. So that should be up in a couple days. And then you guys can revisit it. So again, thank you everyone, Tim, Peter, and have a happy holidays, everybody.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
You too.
Thanks a lot.
So much, Tim and Peter.
Thank you.